The winter wind howled across Pine Valley as three notorious outlaws approached the isolated homestead, their intentions as dark as the gathering storm clouds above. They couldn't have known that the quiet widow tending her garden, her silver hair caught in the bitter breeze, was once known as swift Sarah Blackwood, the deadliest gun hand west of the Mississippi, with more confirmed kills than any lawman in 4 territories. Their mistake would be their last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter wind howled across Pine Valley as 3 notorious outlaws approached the isolated homestead, their intentions as dark as the gathering storm clouds above. They couldn't have known that the quiet widow tending her garden, her silver hair caught in the bitter breeze, was once known as swift Sarah Blackwood, the deadliest gun hand west of the Mississippi, with more confirmed kills than any lawman in 4 territories. Their mistake would be their last. If you're watching from somewhere with harsh winters, let us know in the comments below. And make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story about a former circus performer turned frontier doctor will leave you speechless. The year was 1878. And the infamous Carson brothers had just crossed into Montana territory, leaving a trail of broken lives and burning homesteads in their wake. Leading the group was James Carson, a towering brute whose scarred face had earned him the nickname Coyote after surviving a pack attack in his youth. The jagged marks running from his left temple to jaw served as a constant reminder of that night, and those who knew him claimed the incident had stripped away whatever humanity he might have once possessed. His younger brother Michael rode beside him, methodically checking the loads in his matched pair of Navy Colts, weapons that had already claimed 12 lives since the first snow fell. The elaborate silver scrollwork on the gun's barrels stood in stark contrast to the cold darkness in their owner's eyes. Michael had always been the quieter of the two, but his silence concealed a cruelty that even hardened outlaws found disturbing. Behind them rode their newest recruit, Billy Quickdraw Harrison, barely 20 years old, but already building a reputation for ruthless efficiency with a gun. His boyish features belied a killer's instinct, honed in the back alleys of Denver, where he'd learned that speed meant survival. What appeared to be just another remote homestead to raid had caught James Carson's eye, specifically because of its apparent vulnerability. A widow living alone, maintaining a modest farm despite the harsh Montana winters. Sarah Matthews, as she was now known to her neighbors, stood in her garden gathering the last of the winter herbs, her work-worn hands moving with practiced efficiency. To any observer, she appeared to be nothing more than another hardy frontier widow, the silver threading through her dark hair and the reading glasses perched on her nose, marking her as someone who had weathered life's storms with quiet dignity. Her modest dress and gentle demeanor had fooled everyone in Pine Valley for the past 2 years, just as she'd intended. What the Carson brothers couldn't see was how those same hands that now gently harvested herbs had once been the fastest drawer in 3 territories, earning her the nickname Swift Sarah, long before she'd added Blackwood to her legend. They didn't notice how her practiced gaze tracked their movement in the reflection of her cabin's window, or how the long skirts of her morning dress concealed a custom-made Remington that had ended more gunfights than most lawmen saw in a lifetime. The weapon's grip bore a distinctive mark, a rising phoenix crafted in silver, known only to members of an elite group of frontier peacekeepers who had operated in secret during the darkest days of the Civil War. Inside her modest cabin, young Mary Wilson watched through the frost-etched window, her hand clutching the cross her father had given her before he was gunned down by bandits 2 years ago. She knew Mrs. Matthews's true identity, or at least pieces of it that she'd gathered during the long winter evenings when the widow had taught her to read by lamplight. She'd seen the mysterious symbol etched into the grip of the Remington that Mrs. Matthews kept hidden beneath the floorboards, though she'd been made to promise never to speak of it. More importantly, she'd witnessed the widow practicing at dawn in the sheltered valley behind the house, drawing and firing with a speed that seemed to defy nature itself. The homestead's apparent isolation had drawn the Carson gang like wolves to wounded prey, but its location had been carefully chosen. Sarah had selected this property for its clear sightlines and natural advantages, just as she'd spent months preparing for the day when her violent past would inevitably catch up with her. Every fence post had been carefully positioned to provide cover, every window reinforced behind its innocent appearance, every possible angle of attack considered and countered. As the Carson brothers dismounted at her front gate, their spurs crunching in the fresh snow, Sarah Matthews carefully removed her gardening gloves. Her movements, though unhurried, carried an underlying grace that seemed at odds with her apparent age. She nodded slightly to Mary through the window, a subtle signal developed over months of careful preparation. The young girl understood. It was time to quietly make her way to the root cellar, just as they had practiced. The Carson gang was infamous throughout Montana Territory for targeting isolated homesteads, especially those owned by women living alone. They had left a trail of destruction across 3 states, their victims suffering, feeding the brothers' twisted sense of power. But they had no way of knowing they had just walked into the carefully laid trap of a legend they believed had died years ago in a blazing gunfight in Dodge City. As James Carson pushed open her garden gate, his cruel smile revealing gold teeth that caught the winter light, Sarah Matthews felt the familiar tension of an approaching storm, one that had nothing to do with the dark clouds gathering overhead. To understand the full weight of what was about to unfold in Pine Valley, we need to return to a time when Sarah Blackwood's name was whispered around campfires with equal measures of awe and terror. A time before, she had traded her gunfighter's outfit for a widow's weeds, before she had chosen this quiet valley as the place to bury both her past and the man whose love had transformed her from an angel of death into a protector of the innocent. The year was 1861, and the nation was tearing itself apart as the Civil War erupted across the land. While armies clashed in the east, the Western Territories descended into a different kind of chaos. In this lawless frontier, a young woman named Sarah Blackwood was about to begin her transformation from a rancher's daughter into the most feared gunslinger in the West. Before we continue with Sarah's story, take a moment to share in the comments where you're from, and if your family has any Civil War history. Don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's tale about a Confederate spy who became a Union hero will keep you on the edge of your seat. The daughter of a Montana rancher, Sarah had learned to shoot before she could write, defending her father's cattle from rustlers and predators alike. But it was the arrival of a mysterious stranger in the spring of 1861 that would forever alter her destiny. Marcus Drake, a former Army scout turned government agent, recognized something special in the way the young woman handled a gun, a natural talent that went beyond mere skill. Drake belonged to a secret organization known as the Phantom Rangers, an elite group of peacekeepers operating outside traditional law enforcement. Their distinctive mark, a silver phoenix rising from flames, was known only to a select few. With the nation divided by war, the Rangers worked to prevent the Western Territories from descending into complete anarchy. "Your speed is a gift," Drake had told her that first day, after watching her dispatch 3 wolves threatening the herd without wasting a single bullet. "But speed alone won't keep you alive in what's coming." He spoke with the weight of someone who had seen the gathering storm and knew the price it would demand. Sarah's training under Drake was relentless. Dawn would find them practicing draws until her fingers bled. Afternoons were spent learning to read terrain and track prey, and evenings were devoted to studying human nature, the tells that signaled a man's intentions before he even reached for his gun. "The fastest draw means nothing," Drake would say, "if you don't know when to use it." But their peaceful training was shattered one autumn evening when a gang of Confederate raiders attacked the ranch. Sarah's father, standing firm against their demands for horses and cattle to support the Southern cause, took a bullet to the chest. As he fell, Sarah's world narrowed to the weight of her Remington and the distance between her and her father's killers. What happened next would become the stuff of frontier legend. 5 raiders fell before they could clear leather, their bodies hitting the ground before the echo of the first shot faded. 2 more managed to mount up, only to be cut down at full gallop, shots that witnesses would later swear were impossible at that distance. The last raider, a young man barely older than Sarah, dropped his gun and ran. She let him go, knowing his tale would spread. Drake found her later that night, cleaning her father's blood from the porch boards. "You're ready," was all he said, presenting her with a Remington revolver bearing the silver phoenix. That night, Sarah Blackwood joined the ranks of the Phantom Rangers, beginning a career that would make her name synonymous with frontier justice. Over the next decade, as the nation struggled to heal its Civil War wounds, Sarah's reputation grew. She operated throughout the Western Territories, often appearing where she was needed most, then vanishing like smoke on the wind. Unlike many gunfighters who sought glory or notoriety, Sarah worked in the shadows, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The silver streak that would later appear in her hair began the night she faced down the notorious Clayton gang in Wyoming. Surrounded in a box canyon, outnumbered 10 to 1, she emerged at dawn the only one standing. But the stress of the fight had left its mark, a streak of silver at her temple that would gradually spread over the years. Some said she was supernatural, blessed with abilities that defied explanation. Others claimed she had made a deal with the devil himself. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. She was simply someone who had transformed tragedy into purpose, honing her natural talents into something extraordinary. But it was her encounter with Thomas Matthews, a quiet shopkeeper in Dodge City, that would ultimately change everything. Thomas saw past the legend to the woman beneath, offering her something she'd never dared hope for: a chance at a normal life. Their courtship was as unconventional as it was genuine, conducted between her missions for the Rangers and his management of the town's most successful dry goods store. When they married in 1875, Sarah believed she had finally found a way to leave her violent past behind. The Phantom Rangers gave their blessing, understanding that even their most effective agent deserved a chance at happiness. Thomas and Sarah relocated to Pine Valley, Montana, where no one knew of swift Sarah Blackwood or her legendary exploits. For 3 years they lived a quiet life, their homestead becoming a place of peace rather than violence. Thomas taught Sarah about merchant ledgers and store inventories, while she gradually adapted to being known simply as Mrs. Matthews, the shopkeeper's wife. But fate had other plans, and one cold winter morning, Thomas rode out to help a neighboring farm and never returned. His body was found frozen in the snow, shot in the back by bandits who were never caught. Sarah maintained her cover as the grieving widow, but inside, swift Sarah Blackwood awakened once more. She began preparing, converting her homestead into a fortress while maintaining its innocent appearance. She knew that sooner or later, the violence she had left behind would find her again. Looking at the Carson brothers approaching her gate, she realized that day had finally arrived. Now, as the winter wind howled across Pine Valley, Sarah Matthews stood ready to remind the world why swift Sarah Blackwood's name had once made even the most hardened outlaws tremble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The harsh Montana winter had transformed Pine Valley into a landscape of stark contrasts. Pristine white snow against dark timber, peaceful homesteads against the looming threat of violence. Sarah Matthews stood motionless in her garden, her hands still wrapped around dried herbs as she watched the Carson brothers approach. 2 years of careful preparation were about to be tested. Inside the cabin, young Mary Wilson had already moved silently toward the root cellar, just as they'd rehearsed countless times. The girl's father had been one of Thomas Matthews's closest friends, and after his murder by bandits, Sarah had taken Mary under her wing. What started as reading lessons had gradually evolved into something more: careful instruction in observation, strategy, and survival. Always watch their eyes, Sarah had told Mary during their lessons. A man's mouth might lie, but his eyes tell the truth. Now, studying James Carson's approaching figure, Sarah saw the predatory gleam that had sealed the fate of so many other homesteaders. His scarred face twisted into what he probably thought was a charming smile, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. The homestead Sarah had created was a masterpiece of deception. Every seemingly decorative feature served a tactical purpose. The rose trellises along the front porch concealed reinforced firing positions. The newly installed gutters were angled to provide perfect sightlines. Even the garden beds were positioned to force visitors along a specific path, one that would leave them exposed if violence erupted. Michael Carson's matched navy Colts caught the winter light as he shifted in his saddle. Sarah noted how he kept his right hand closer to his gun, despite being left-handed, a tell that had cost many men their lives when they expected his draw to come from the wrong side. Behind him, young Billy Harrison tried to project confidence, but his constant adjustments to his gun belt betrayed his nervousness. "Fine day for a visit, ma'am," James Carson called out, his voice carrying the forced politeness of a predator playing with its prey. "Hope we're not interrupting your gardening." The gold teeth in his smile gleamed dully in the winter light. Sarah straightened slowly, playing the role of the unsuspecting widow to perfection. "Not at all," she replied, her voice carrying the slight tremor expected of an aging woman in the cold, "though I'm afraid I don't have much to offer visitors this time of year." Her hands, still holding the herbs, remained visible and non-threatening. Around the homestead, nature itself seemed to hold its breath. The winter wind that had been howling all morning suddenly died, leaving an eerie stillness, broken only by the crunch of snow under the outlaws' boots. A lone raven watched from a nearby pine tree, as if sensing the approaching violence. "Oh, don't you worry about hospitality, Mrs. Matthews," Michael Carson drawled, swinging down from his horse. "We'll help ourselves to whatever we need." His brother's laugh carried a cruel edge that had heralded death for countless victims across 3 territories. Sarah's mind catalogued every detail with the precision that had once made her legendary. James Carson stood slightly favoring his right leg, an old injury that would slow his draw. Michael's fancy guns were spotlessly clean, suggesting form over function. Young Harrison's nervous energy would make him quick but probably inaccurate. Inside the cabin, Mary peered through a carefully drilled hole in the root cellar's ceiling. She had her own role to play in what was coming, tasks that Sarah had drilled into her with the same patience she'd shown teaching her to read. "Sometimes survival isn't about being the fastest or strongest," Sarah had told her. "It's about being the smartest and most prepared." The Carson brothers had chosen her homestead for the same reasons they'd selected all their victims: isolated location, apparent vulnerability, and the assumption that a widow living alone would be easy prey. They had no way of knowing that every feature they saw as a weakness had been carefully crafted to appear that way. "We've been riding hard," James Carson said, moving closer to the garden gate. "Thought we might rest our horses here for a spell." His hand rested casually near his holster, a gesture that had preceded violence countless times before. "Maybe sample some of that famous Montana hospitality we've heard so much about." Sarah's fingers moved almost imperceptibly, checking the position of her concealed Remington through the folds of her dress. The weight of the weapon was comforting, like greeting an old friend. In her mind, she could feel the silver phoenix on its grip warming to her touch, as if awakening from a long slumber. "Hospitality is sacred in these parts," she replied, her voice carrying an edge that none of them yet recognized. "Though I seem to recall it needs to be freely offered, not taken by force." The words hung in the frozen air like smoke from a gun barrel. For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered across James Carson's scarred face. It was the same look Sarah had seen countless times before, the moment when a predator suddenly realized it might have become prey. Behind him, Michael's hand drifted closer to his elaborately decorated Colts, while young Harrison shifted uneasily, sensing something wasn't quite right. The winter sun emerged briefly from behind the clouds, catching the silver in Sarah's hair and making it gleam like the barrel of a well-polished gun. In that moment, as the Carson brothers stood unwittingly on the threshold of their own reckoning, the legend of swift Sarah Blackwood prepared to resurface in a storm of lead and justice. James Carson's scarred face darkened at Sarah's subtle defiance, the practiced smile slipping to reveal something far more dangerous beneath. He took another step toward the garden gate, his spurs leaving deep marks in the pristine snow. "Ma'am," he drawled, the false politeness now carrying a lethal edge. "I don't think you understand your situation here." Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson's hand tightened around the signal mirror she held, another of Sarah's careful preparations. The young girl's heart raced, but her hands remained steady. Sarah had taught her that fear was natural, but control was essential. Through the root cellar's cleverly disguised viewing hole, she could see everything unfolding in the yard above. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of countless confrontations. She carefully set her gardening tools aside, each movement measured and deliberate. 3 men riding hard from the north, avoiding the main trails. 2 sets of reinforced saddlebags, probably carrying ill-gotten gains, and enough weapons between you to start a small war. Michael Carson's hand moved closer to his ornate navy Colts, his eyes narrowing at the widow's unexpected observation. "You've got keen eyes for an old woman," he said, the threat in his voice barely concealed. Behind him, young Billy Harrison shifted nervously, his earlier bravado cracking under the strange tension that had begun to fill the air. "You learned to notice things, living alone out here," Sarah continued, her fingers brushing against her concealed Remington through her skirts. "Like how a man favors his right leg when he's nursing an old bullet wound, or how decorated pistols often belong to men more interested in show than substance." James Carson's face contorted with rage, the scars from the coyote attack standing out white against his flushed skin. "Enough games," he snarled, his hand dropping to his holster. "This is how it's going to work. You're going to invite us inside, show us every hiding place where you've stashed anything valuable, and maybe, just maybe, we'll leave you with enough supplies to survive the winter." The threat hung in the frozen air like icicles, sharp, deadly, and ready to fall. But Sarah Matthews stood unmoved, her silver-streaked hair catching the winter light. 2 years of maintaining her cover, of playing the role of the humble widow, had prepared her for this moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried echoes of swift Sarah Blackwood that made even James Carson pause. "Let me tell you how this is actually going to work," she said, her tone carrying the same finality that had once made her legend. "You're going to turn around, mount those horses you probably stole, and ride out of my valley. Because if you don't, I promise you won't leave here the same way you came in." The younger Harrison actually took a step back, something in the widow's voice triggering deep survival instincts. But James Carson had built his reputation on violence, and he wasn't about to be threatened by a woman he saw as nothing more than another easy target. "Get her," he commanded, drawing his pistol with the speed that had ended many lives. But Sarah Matthews was already moving, her supposedly frail body displaying the liquid grace that had once made swift Sarah Blackwood the fastest gun in 3 territories. The Remington seemed to materialize in her hand, its silver phoenix catching the winter sun as she drew and fired in one fluid motion. James Carson's gun went spinning into a snowbank, along with 2 fingers from his shooting hand. His howl of pain and rage echoed across the valley as Michael Carson and young Harrison struggled to process what they had just witnessed. "That was your first and only warning shot," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the same steady calm that had once made hardened gunfighters reconsider their life choices. The Remington remained level, unwavering despite the bitter cold. The next one won't be nearly as merciful. Michael Carson recovered first, his fancy Colts clearing leather with practiced speed. But Sarah had already disappeared behind one of her strategically placed rose trellises, the seemingly decorative structure now serving its true purpose as cover. His shots splintered wood where she had been standing moments before. Inside the root cellar, Mary Wilson remembered her instructions. As the first shots rang out, she used the signal mirror to flash a predetermined pattern toward the distant hillside where Sarah had arranged another surprise for the Carson gang. The girls' hands remained steady, just as they had during their secret practice sessions. Young Harrison, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, tried to drag James Carson toward the minimal cover offered by their horses. The older man's curses mixed with the sound of Michael's continued firing, the elaborate engravings on his Colts doing nothing to improve his accuracy against a target that seemed to move like smoke. "Last chance," Sarah's voice carried across the yard, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, another trick she'd learned during her Phantom Ranger days. "Ride out now, or this becomes the kind of story that will haunt saloons for years to come." But the Carson brothers hadn't built their bloody reputation by backing down. James Carson, clutching his maimed hand to his chest, snarled orders to his companions. They began spreading out, trying to flank the positions where they thought the widow might be hiding. Their confidence was shaken, but not yet broken. They didn't notice how Sarah's carefully planned garden paths were herding them exactly where she wanted them. Didn't see how Mary's signal mirror had alerted watchers on the distant ridge. Didn't realize that everything, from the placement of the woodpile to the angle of the porch steps, had been arranged for this very moment. The winter wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of violence as old as the West itself. Swift Sarah Blackwood was about to remind these men why her name had once made even the bravest gunslingers think twice about drawing iron. The winter landscape of Pine Valley had transformed into a deadly chessboard, with Sarah Matthews controlling every move. Michael Carson's fancy Colts continued to bark uselessly at shadows, while James nursed his maimed hand behind their horses, his face twisted into a mask of pain and fury. Young Harrison kept glancing toward the valley's entrance, clearly wrestling with the instinct to flee. "8 shots, Michael," Sarah's voice carried across the yard, still seemingly coming from multiple directions. "Those Navy Colts only hold 6 each. By my count, you've wasted 14 already." The calculation was precise, deliberate. Another lesson from her Phantom Ranger days. Make them doubt, make them count, make them fear. Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson maintained her position at the observation point, watching the scene unfold through carefully placed spy holes. Sarah had trained her for this, taught her to be more than just a lookout. "Knowledge wins battles before they're fought," she'd told the girl during their long evening lessons. Now Mary's keen eyes tracked every movement, noting details just as she'd been taught. "Whoever you are," James Carson shouted, his voice raw with rage and pain, "you have no idea what you've started. We've got friends, powerful friends. They'll burn this whole valley to find you." Blood dripped from his mangled hand, staining the pristine snow crimson. Sarah's laugh echoed off the surrounding hills, carrying the edge that had once made her legend. Friends? You mean the Hawkins gang camped 3 miles north, or maybe the 2 scouts you left watching the valley entrance? She let the words sink in before continuing. They won't be joining us. This revelation sent a visible shock through the Carson brothers. Michael's next shot went wild, betraying his shaken confidence. Young Harrison's face went pale. He'd been counting on that backup, not knowing that Sarah had spent the past week systematically neutralizing every potential ally the Carson gang had in the territory. See, that's the trouble with men like you, Sarah continued, using her voice to disguise her movement between pre-planned positions. You think because something looks vulnerable it must be. Never occurs to you that someone might be counting on that assumption. The garden paths Sarah had so carefully maintained throughout the winter now proved their worth. While they appeared to be simple walkways between herb beds, they had been meticulously designed to channel movement. Every time the Carson gang tried to advance, they found themselves naturally flowing into killing zones covered by multiple angles. Mary's signal mirror flashed again, this time catching Michael's eye and momentarily blinding him. It was no accident. Sarah had calculated the sun's position for this time of day, another layer in her intricate trap. The brief distraction was all she needed to change positions again, moving like smoke between her carefully prepared fighting positions. You know what I've noticed about famous gunfighters? Sarah's voice carried a teacher's tone now, as if sharing wisdom with particularly slow students. They spend so much time working on their draw, they forget about everything else, like how to fight when you're cold, or tired, or bleeding. As if to emphasize her point, a shot rang out. Michael Carson screamed as his left boot exploded, the bullet destroying his fancy spur without breaking skin. A warning shot of surgical precision, delivered with the casual ease of someone who could have easily aimed higher. That's 2 warnings now, Sarah announced, her voice hardening. More than I usually give, but I made a promise once, to a good man, that I'd try mercy before violence. The mention of Thomas brought a familiar ache to her chest, but her aim remained steady. Young Harrison finally broke, making a dash for his horse. But Sarah had anticipated this too. A shot rang out, and his gun belt fell to the snow, the buckle shattered. "Going somewhere, boy." Her voice carried almost maternal disappointment. "Sit down before you get hurt." Inside the cabin, Mary watched in fascination as Sarah's careful preparations continued to unfold. Every feature of the homestead that had seemed innocent now revealed its tactical purpose. The woodpile Harrison tried to use as cover was strategically stacked to leave gaps for shots while appearing solid. The rain barrel by the porch had been positioned to reflect movement from blind spots. James Carson, despite his injury, proved why he'd survived so long in his brutal profession. "She can't be everywhere," he growled to his brother. "Rush her together, different directions. She's just one old woman." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. One old woman? Sarah's laugh carried genuine amusement now. "Let me explain something about age, Mr. Carson. You don't live long in this profession by being predictable." As if to prove her point, another shot rang out. The decorative wind chimes by the porch exploded, showering Michael with fragments of metal and forcing him to dive for cover. "You see, while you boys were building your reputation for cruelty, I was learning something far more valuable." Sarah's voice hardened again. "I learned that survival isn't about being the fastest draw or the deadliest shot. It's about being smarter than what's trying to kill you." The winter wind carried the metallic scent of blood and gunsmoke across the valley. Sarah Matthews, the quiet widow, had transformed her homestead into a deadly maze where every innocent feature concealed a lethal purpose. The Carson brothers, who had terrorized the territory with impunity, were about to learn why swift Sarah Blackwood's name had once made even the most hardened outlaws pray for mercy. As the confrontation at the homestead intensified, Memories of another winter day flashed through Sarah's mind. It had been during her Phantom Ranger days in a snow-covered Wyoming canyon where she'd learned the most valuable lesson of her career from Marcus Drake. The difference between a gunfighter and a survivor, he'd told her, is that a gunfighter thinks about the draw, while a survivor thinks about everything else. Now, watching the Carson brothers struggle against her carefully laid trap, those words rang truer than ever. James Carson had managed to bind his bleeding hand with a bandana, his face a mask of hatred as he tried to coordinate with his brother. Michael's expensive boots left bloody prints in the snow from his shattered spur, while young Harrison sat trembling against the woodpile, his empty gun belt a stark reminder of his powerlessness. "You know what's interesting about this valley?" Sarah's voice carried across the yard, steady and conversational, despite the tension. "The way the wind moves through it. Those gusts you hear, they're not random." On cue, a bitter blast of winter wind howled through the homestead, carrying stinging snow that forced the Carson brothers to shield their eyes. Mary Wilson, still at her observation post, watched in amazement as Sarah used the moment to ghost between positions. Even knowing what to look for, the girl could barely track her mentor's movement. The widow had spent months teaching her about the valley's weather patterns, but only now did Mary understand the full tactical importance of those lessons. "Thomas used to say I was fussy about where we built," Sarah continued, her voice now coming from a completely different direction. "Couldn't understand why I insisted on this exact spot. Poor man never knew he'd married a woman who'd spent years studying how terrain affects gunfights." The mention of her late husband brought a familiar ache to Sarah's heart, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for grief later. Now she needed to maintain the psychological pressure that was slowly breaking down the Carson gang's confidence. 47, she called out, making James Carson's head snap around trying to locate her. "That's how many men made the mistake you're making right now, thinking they had the advantage of numbers, thinking age and appearance meant weakness." Another shot rang out, splitting a fence post inches from Michael's head. Want to guess how many of them lived to learn from that mistake? Inside the cabin, Mary remembered the mysterious ledger she'd discovered while cleaning, the one Sarah had quickly hidden away. Now she wondered if those pages contained the stories behind that number, the history of swift Sarah Blackwood before she became the widow Matthews. "You's lying!" Michael Carson shouted, his composure cracking. "Ain't no woman ever took down that many men." But his voice carried the edge of doubt, the growing fear that they'd walked into something far more dangerous than an isolated homestead. Sarah's laugh carried across the yard, sharp as the crack of a gun. "Your brother's already lost 2 fingers, finding out how wrong you are. Care to test that theory further?" As if to emphasize her point, another shot rang out, this one destroying the heel of Michael's already damaged boot. Young Harrison, still huddled by the woodpile, suddenly spoke up. "I heard stories," he said, his young voice shaking, "about a woman gunfighter during the war. They said she could shoot the flames off a candle at 20 paces. Said she worked for some secret group." "Shut up, boy!" James Carson snarled, but the damage was done. The mention of those old stories had clearly rattled him, forcing him to reassess their situation through a new and terrifying lens. Sarah used their moment of confusion to implement the next phase of her plan. A sharp whistle, seemingly carried on the wind itself, triggered a response from the distant ridge. The flash of Mary's signal mirror had done more than just blind Michael. It had alerted Sarah's allies, people in the valley who owed their lives and safety to the quiet widow who'd protected them for the past 2 years. "Remember what I said about friends?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of satisfaction now. "About your backup not coming? Well, let me introduce you to mine." On cue, rifle shots rang out from multiple directions, kicking up snow around the Carson gang's feet. The message was clear. They were surrounded. "Impossible," James Carson breathed, his face going pale beneath his scars. The tactical situation had completely reversed. What had seemed like an easy target had transformed into a killing ground, with them caught in the middle. "You wanted to know what I understand about my situation." Sarah's voice carried the weight of decades of experience now. "I understand that every person you've terrorized, every homestead you've raided, every life you've destroyed, they all led you here, to this valley, to this day, to me." The winter sun broke through the clouds again, catching the silver in Sarah's hair as she emerged from cover, her Remington steady in hands that had never lost their lethal skill. The phoenix mark on its grip seemed to glow in the harsh light, a symbol of justice, long delayed, but finally at hand. "Last chance, gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used in countless confrontations before, "though truth be told, I'm not sure you deserve even that much mercy." The Remington in her hand looked as natural as a garden tool had earlier, perhaps even more so. The Carson brothers, who had built their reputation on preying on the seemingly helpless, were about to learn why swift Sarah Blackwood's name had once been whispered as a prayer by the innocent and a curse by the wicked. The quiet widow of Pine Valley was about to remind the world that sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones that learn to hide in plain sight. The Carson brothers' world had shrunk to the confines of Sarah Matthews' front yard, a space that had transformed from a simple homestead into a tactical nightmare. James Carson's blood continued to stain the snow crimson from his mangled hand, while Michael's ruined boots crunched awkwardly with each movement. Young Harrison remained frozen by the woodpile, his empty gun belt a constant reminder of their miscalculation. "You know what makes a perfect shot?" Sarah's voice carried across the yard, steady and almost educational in tone. "It's not about natural talent. It's not even about practice, though God knows I've put in my share." Another shot rang out, splitting a branch that Michael had been trying to use for cover. "It's about patience, about knowing exactly when to pull the trigger." Mary Wilson watched from her observation post as Sarah's carefully orchestrated plan continued to unfold. The girl had spent months learning the widow's lessons, but only now did she fully understand their depth. Each shot, each movement, each word was calculated to break down the outlaw's confidence and control. "Way I heard it," young Harrison suddenly spoke up, his voice shaking but unable to contain himself. "Swift Sarah Blackwood died in a shootout in Dodge City. Took down 15 men before a lucky shot got her." His eyes darted nervously around the yard, trying to reconcile those old stories with their current situation. Sarah's laugh carried across the winter air, sharp and dangerous. 15 men, was it? Funny how stories grow with each telling. The Remington in her hand caught the sunlight, the phoenix mark seeming to shimmer. Truth is, it was 12 men, and that lucky shot barely creased my arm. But sometimes, boy, the best thing a legend can do is die publicly. James Carson, despite his pain and rage, proved his cunning by trying to use the conversation to pinpoint her location. But Sarah had spent too many years surviving to fall for such basic tactics. Her voice seemed to shift with the wind, making it impossible to track her movements. "The thing about legends," she continued, her tone almost philosophical, "is that they're more useful when people think they're dead. Makes them careless, makes them forget to look over their shoulder, makes them think they can threaten a lonely widow without consequences." Michael Carson, his fancy guns now more hindrance than help in the bitter cold, attempted to circle around the garden. But Sarah had designed every path, every flower bed, every seemingly random feature to funnel movement exactly where she wanted it. A shot rang out, and his gun belt joined Harrison's in the snow, the fancy silver buckle shattered. "That's 3 opportunities I've given you to surrender," Sarah announced, her voice hardening. "More chances than I gave the Madison gang in '69, more mercy than I showed the Whitfield brothers in '71. Each name carried weight, triggering recognition and growing fear in the Carson brothers' eyes. Inside the cabin, Mary remembered the quiet evenings when Sarah had taught her about more than just reading and writing. "Survival isn't just about strength," she'd said, demonstrating how to hold a mirror to see around corners. "It's about understanding how people think, how they move, how they react when fear starts taking hold." James Carson, his face contorted with pain and fury, made a desperate attempt to rally his men. "She's just one woman," he shouted, though his voice carried less conviction now. "Rush her together. She can't shoot all of us at once." Sarah's response was a rapid series of shots that kicked up snow in a perfect circle around James, each bullet exactly the same distance from his feet. A display of marksmanship that turned his rallying cry hollow. "An interesting theory," she replied, her voice carrying echoes of countless gunfights past. "Care to test it? Though I should warn you, the Sutton gang tried something similar in '73. You can still find their bones in that canyon up in Wyoming." The winter wind picked up again, carrying the distant sound of approaching riders, Sarah's allies responding to Mary's signal. But the Carson gang, trapped in their tactical nightmare, couldn't tell if the sounds were real or just another trick of the wind and their increasingly frayed nerves. "You want to know something interesting about fear?" Sarah's voice took on an almost scholarly tone. "It's not the fast death men are truly afraid of. It's the slow realization that they're outmatched. The gradual understanding that every choice they've made has led them into a trap they can't escape." The sun broke through the clouds again, casting harsh shadows across the homestead. In that moment, James Carson caught a glimpse of movement that made his blood run cold. The widow Matthews didn't move like an aging woman anymore. Her every motion carried the fluid grace of a predator, the kind of deadly efficiency that only comes from decades of survival. "I spent 20 years building a legend," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of every gunfight, every life-or-death moment that had put silver in her hair. "Then I spent 2 years carefully burying it, but you boys just had to come digging." The Remington in her hand moved with impossible speed, destroying the last bit of cover Michael was trying to reach. The Carson brothers, who had terrorized 3 territories with impunity, found themselves facing a grim realization. They hadn't stumbled upon an easy target. They had walked willingly into the lair of a legend they thought was dead, and that legend was about to remind them why swift Sarah Blackwood's name had once made even the bravest men reconsider their life choices. The bitter Montana wind carried the distant sound of wolves across Pine Valley as Sarah Matthews continued her deadly game of cat and mouse. Each passing moment stripped away another layer of the Carson brothers' infamous bravado, revealing the desperate men beneath. The once pristine snow around the homestead now told a story of violence in tracks, blood, and scattered bullets. "You know what's remarkable about wolves?" Sarah's voice drifted across the yard, carrying the same easy confidence that had made her legend decades ago. "They're patient. They don't waste energy on flashy attacks or bold charges. They wear their prey down bit by bit until there's nothing left but surrender." Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson noticed a subtle shift in the wind's direction. She remembered Sarah's lessons about weather patterns, about how the valley's unique geography could turn nature itself into a weapon. Right on cue, bitter snow began whipping across the yard, stinging the eyes of the Carson gang while leaving Sarah's carefully chosen positions protected. James Carson, his injured hand now frozen and useless, had retreated behind their horses. His face, already fearsome from the coyote scars, had taken on a desperate edge that made him even more dangerous. "Brother," he called to Michael, his voice barely carrying over the wind, "the barn, if we can reach it." Sarah's laugh cut through the air like a knife. "The barn? You mean the one I spent 2 years modifying?" Another shot rang out, splintering the corner post James had been eyeing. Every board carefully placed, every shadow measured, every angle considered. By all means, make your try. Michael Carson, his fancy boots leaving uneven tracks in the blood-stained snow, had begun to show signs of the cold seeping into his bones. His elaborate gun belt lay useless beside Harrison's, both stripped away by Sarah's precise shooting. Now he clutched a knife, the blade catching what little sunlight penetrated the growing storm. "Speaking of modifications," Sarah continued, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the wind, "you boys might be interested in knowing what else I've been up to these past 2 years." As if on cue, Mary activated another of Sarah's preparations. The girl pulled a hidden lever, and suddenly half the barn's facade swung open on concealed hinges, exposing the Carson brothers to fire from yet another angle. "Impossible," Michael breathed, watching the building he'd thought might offer sanctuary transform into another threat. His knife hand trembled, though whether from cold or fear was hard to tell. Young Harrison, still huddled by the woodpile, had begun muttering prayers under his breath. The stories he'd heard in saloons about swift Sarah Blackwood paled in comparison to the reality they now faced. Each shot, each word, each revelation stripped away another layer of his youthful bravado. "Did you know," Sarah's voice took on an almost conversational tone, "that Thomas used to tease me about my improvements to the homestead, called me his carpenter queen?" The mention of her late husband carried a weight of emotion that even the hardened outlaws could hear. "He never knew why I insisted on reinforcing certain walls, or adding hidden passages, or placing windows at specific angles. Poor man thought I was just being thorough." James Carson, desperation finally overwhelming his caution, decided to make his move. He lunged for his horse's reins, presumably planning to use the animal as moving cover. But Sarah had anticipated this too. A single shot sent the horses bolting, leaving the Carson brothers even more exposed in the growing storm. "That was Thomas's favorite horse," Sarah noted, her voice carrying an edge of genuine regret. "Took me weeks to train him not to spook at gunfire. Seems a waste, but then again, you boys have been wasting things your whole lives, haven't you? Lives, chances, choices." Mary watched in fascination as Sarah's carefully laid plan continued to unfold. Each element of the homestead that had seemed ordinary now revealed its tactical purpose. The garden's raised beds provided perfect shooting positions while appearing decorative. The wind chimes served as both early warning system and range markers. Even the well's placement had been carefully calculated to funnel movement in predictable patterns. "Here's something to consider," Sarah's voice cut through the wind again. "In all the stories you've heard about swift Sarah Blackwood, did anyone ever mention why she was so hard to track? Why so many men died trying to ambush her?" She let the question hang in the bitter air for a moment. "It's because she never did the expected thing. Never took the obvious path. Never trusted to speed alone when patience would serve better." The winter storm had intensified, but somehow Sarah's shots remained precise, each one demonstrating her complete control of the situation. 20 years of gunfights teaches you things," she continued, "like how men react when their plans fall apart, how they handle fear, how they face the realization that they've walked into a trap they can't shoot their way out of." James Carson, his face a mask of pain and fury, made one last attempt to salvage their situation. "You can't keep this up forever," he shouted into the wind. "Even legends get tired. Even legends make mistakes." Sarah's response was another impossibly precise shot that shattered the knife in Michael's hand, leaving him completely disarmed. "That's true," she acknowledged, her voice carrying decades of experience. "But legends also learn from their mistakes. Do you know how many men have tried to wait me out over the years? How many thought they could outlast me?" The wind carried her soft laugh. "Let's just say none of them lived to try again. The storm continued to build, transforming Pine Valley into a white hell of driving snow and bitter wind. But within this maelstrom, Sarah Matthews moved like a ghost, each position carefully prepared, each shot calculated, each word designed to break down the last remnants of the Carson brothers' resolve. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood was no longer just a story told in saloons. It was a harsh reality that three desperate men were learning to fear. The howling winter storm had transformed Pine Valley into a world of white chaos, but the crack of Sarah's Remington still cut through the wind with deadly precision. The Carson brothers, stripped of their usual advantages, found themselves caught in an ever-tightening noose of their own making. But fate had one more card to play in this deadly game. Through the swirling snow, a new figure emerged at the edge of the property. David Carson, the eldest of the brothers, thought long dead in a prison riot 3 years ago, approached through the storm. His arrival sent a visible shock through both his brothers and Sarah, whose carefully controlled breathing hitched for just a moment. "Well, well," David's voice carried across the yard, as cold as the driving snow. "If it isn't swift Sarah Blackwood herself, I've been waiting a long time for this reunion." He moved with the deliberate grace of a seasoned killer, his long coat concealing what Sarah knew would be a custom-made Walker Colt, the same gun that had killed Thomas. Mary Wilson, watching from her observation post, saw something she'd never witnessed before, a flicker of genuine concern cross Sarah's face. The girl remembered late-night conversations, fragments of stories about a prison break that had gone wrong, about a debt of blood that remained unpaid. "David Carson," Sarah's voice remained steady, though there was a new edge to it. "The reports of your death were greatly exaggerated, I see, though I have to say, prison seems to have improved your timing." She shifted position, maintaining her tactical advantage despite the new threat. James Carson, still nursing his maimed hand, looked at his eldest brother with a mixture of shock and hope. "David, but they said the riot at Yuma." His voice trailed off as David raised a hand for silence, never taking his eyes off Sarah's position. "You want to know something interesting about prison, Sarah?" David's voice carried the weight of years spent plotting revenge. "It gives a man time to think, time to plan. Time to learn everything there is to know about the woman who put him there." He took another step forward, seemingly unconcerned by the deadly accuracy she'd already demonstrated. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. David's presence changed everything. He knew her methods, had studied her tactics during their encounters as Phantom Rangers before his fall from grace. More importantly, he knew about Thomas, about what had really happened that winter day 2 years ago. "The boys here thought they were just hitting another lonely homestead," David continued, gesturing to his brothers. "But I've been watching you, Sarah, watching you build this little fortress, watching you train that girl in there, watching you prepare for a day you knew would come." Mary's hand tightened on her signal mirror. Sarah had never mentioned David Carson in their lessons, but the girl could sense the history between them, heavy as storm clouds and just as dangerous. "You're still using the same tricks," David observed, taking another measured step forward. "The multiple firing positions, the carefully planned paths, even that signal mirror the girl's holding. We used to use those in the Rangers, didn't we, Sarah?" Inside the cabin, Mary saw Sarah move with liquid grace to a new position, but there was a tension in her movement that hadn't been there before. This wasn't part of the plan. This was something else entirely. "You want to know what really happened at Yuma?" David's voice carried a cruel smile. "How I survived that riot. I had help. The same kind of help that told me where to find Thomas that day. The same kind that's been keeping me informed about your movements ever since." Sarah's response was a shot that should have taken David's hat off, but he was already moving, displaying the same preternatural speed that had once made them both legends. "You're slipping, Sarah," he taunted. Time was, you wouldn't have missed that shot. The storm intensified, but now it seemed to work against Sarah's carefully laid plans. David knew her tactics, knew how she used weather and terrain to her advantage. He had been more than just another phantom ranger. He had been her partner, her friend, before ambition and greed had turned him into something else entirely. "Tell me, Sarah," David called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "Does the girl know the truth about Thomas, about why he really died, about the choice you made that day?" Each word was calculated to cut deeper than any bullet. Young Harrison, still by the woodpile, looked between the brothers in confusion. But Michael and James had begun to smile, understanding dawning in their eyes. Their seemingly hopeless situation had suddenly shifted with the arrival of the one person who knew all of swift Sarah Blackwood's secrets. "You always were too clever for your own good, Sarah," David continued, moving laterally to force her to adjust her position. "Always thinking 3 steps ahead, but you forgot something important. You forgot that some ghosts don't stay buried, no matter how deep you put them." The winter wind carried the weight of unspoken history between them, of betrayals and choices that had led them all to this moment. Sarah Matthews, the quiet widow of Pine Valley, found herself facing not just a dangerous opponent, but a man who knew exactly who she had been, and more importantly, who she had become. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood was about to face its greatest test, not against superior numbers or faster guns, but against the one person who knew all her secrets, all her tactics, all her fears. The storm that had been her ally now seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this deadly reunion would end. The winter storm swirled around Pine Valley like a living thing, but the tension between Sarah and David Carson burned hotter than any cold could touch. The other Carson brothers had fallen silent, watching this reunion of old partners with the wary attention of wolves scenting blood in the wind. "You remember Tucson, Sarah?" David's voice carried across the yard, laden with memory. "That night when we took down the Henderson gang, you had everything planned out just like this, every angle covered, every escape route blocked." He moved with deliberate grace through the snow, each step calculated. "But you didn't expect Henderson to have inside information then either." Sarah's response was measured, careful. "As I recall, you were the only one who knew our plans that night, David. Just like you were the only one who knew about the Yuma prison transfer." Her voice hardened. "Just like you were the only one who knew where Thomas and I had settled." Through her observation post, Mary Wilson watched the subtle shift in dynamics. The confidence that had marked Sarah's every move earlier now carried an edge of caution. The girl remembered fragments of late-night conversations, whispered stories about betrayal and loss that suddenly carried new weight. "You always did think you were the smartest one in the room," David continued, his hand hovering near his concealed Walker Colt. "Planning everything down to the smallest detail, but you forgot something important, Sarah. You forgot that some of us were watching, learning, adapting." Inside the cabin, Mary noticed movement in the distance. Through the swirling snow, she could make out figures approaching, members of the community Sarah had protected for the past 2 years. The signal mirror had done more than just blind Michael Carson. It had called for help from people who owed the widow Matthews their lives. "I know about the tunnel system under the barn," David announced, making Sarah's breath catch slightly. "The one you modified from the old silver mine shaft. Know about the reinforced walls in the root cellar too. Even know about the cache of weapons you've got hidden in the false floor under your bed." He smiled coldly. "Been watching you build this fortress for months, Sarah. Watching and waiting." James Carson, his maimed hand forgotten in the revelation of his brother's return, had begun moving toward David's position. Michael, too, seemed to draw strength from their eldest brother's presence. Even young Harrison's fear had been replaced by a predatory anticipation, but Sarah Matthews had not survived 20 years as a legend by being predictable. "Interesting thing about watching, David," she replied, her voice carrying an edge that made even David pause. "Sometimes you see exactly what someone wants you to see." As if on cue, a shot rang out from the ridge, not from Sarah's position, but from one of her allies. The bullet kicked up snow at David's feet, making him dance back. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions. The Carson brothers' tactical advantage evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. "You're not the only one who's been planning, old friend." Sarah's voice carried a grim satisfaction. "These past 2 years, while you were watching me, I was building something you never understood. Community, loyalty, trust." Through the storm emerged figures Sarah had carefully cultivated as allies. Robert Chen, the blacksmith who'd helped her reinforce the barn doors. Maria Vasquez, whose family Sarah had protected from rustlers last spring. Old Tom Wheeler, whose marksmanship had earned him respect in 3 wars. Each one moved with purpose, taking up positions Sarah had prepared long ago. David's face darkened as he realized the trap within the trap. "You think these farmers and shopkeepers can stand against us? Against men who've killed for sport?" But there was something new in his voice. Uncertainty. "I think," Sarah replied, her confidence returning, "that you forgot the most important lesson we learned in the Rangers. The one about how a person's true strength isn't in their gun hand, it's in the people willing to stand beside them." Mary watched as more townspeople emerged from the storm, each one carrying a weapon, each one moving to predetermined positions. Sarah hadn't just been teaching Mary these past 2 years. She'd been preparing the entire community for this moment. "You see, David," Sarah continued, "while you were studying my tactics, learning my tricks, I was building something you never could. Something that all your planning and watching couldn't account for." The wind carried her words across the yard. "I was building a family." James Carson, sensing the shift in power, made a desperate grab for his dropped gun. But before he could reach it, a shot from Maria Vasquez sent him scrambling back. Michael's attempt to reach the barn was similarly thwarted by Chen's precise fire. Young Harrison, his earlier bravado completely shattered, dropped to his knees in the snow. David Carson stood motionless, his cold eyes taking in the situation. The fortress he thought he had figured out had just revealed another layer of defense, not walls or weapons, but people willing to risk their lives for the widow who had protected them. "Remember what you used to say about legends, David?" Sarah's voice carried clearly despite the storm. "About how the best ones are built on truth." The wind died down for a moment, revealing just how many rifles were now trained on the Carson brothers. "Well, here's the truth you missed while you were watching so carefully. Swift Sarah Blackwood didn't die in Dodge City. She didn't even retire. She just found something worth protecting." The storm continued to rage around Pine Valley, but within its fury a new kind of strength had emerged. The quiet widow, who had seemed an easy target, had transformed not just herself, but an entire community into something the Carson brothers had never anticipated. A force united by loyalty, trained by experience, and ready to defend their own. The winter storm paused, as if nature itself was holding its breath to witness what would unfold in Pine Valley. David Carson stood in the center of the yard, his calculating eyes taking in every detail of the situation he thought he had controlled. His brothers, James still nursing his maimed hand, and Michael without his fancy guns, had clustered near him, while young Harrison remained kneeling in the snow, all pretense of bravado stripped away. "Impressive, Sarah," David's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Very impressive, but you've overlooked something crucial." His hand moved slightly, drawing attention to the Walker Colt hidden beneath his coat. "The same thing you overlooked in Dodge City." Sarah's response was immediate. "You mean the backup shooters you've got positioned in the tree line?" Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction that made David's eyes narrow. "The ones who've been trying to work their way around to the North Ridge for the past hour?" On cue, shots rang out from multiple directions. A moment later, 4 men emerged from the woods with their hands raised, Robert Chen and old Tom Wheeler marching them forward at rifle point. David's face darkened as another layer of his carefully laid plan crumbled. "You always did like to keep an ace in your sleeve, David," Sarah continued, her voice carrying decades of experience. "Problem is, you're still playing by the old rules, still thinking like a ranger instead of a protector." Mary Wilson, watching from her observation post, saw something shift in the yard's deadly tableau. The townspeople Sarah had rallied weren't just pointing guns, they were moving with practiced coordination, taking up positions they had clearly rehearsed many times before. "You want to know what really happened that day in Dodge City?" Sarah's voice took on an edge that made even David pause. "Why I let everyone think Swift Sarah Blackwood had died. It wasn't because of a lucky shot or a clever ambush. It was because I finally understood something you never did." And the wind picked up again, carrying the bone-deep cold that Montana winters were famous for. But none of the players in this deadly drama seemed to notice. They were all focused on the words being exchanged between 2 legends who had once been partners. "I understood that the fastest gun, the cleverest plan, the deadliest shot, none of it matters as much as having something worth dying for." Sarah's words cut through the wind like bullets. More importantly, having something worth living for. Inside the cabin, Mary remembered the quiet evenings when Sarah had taught more than just reading and shooting. She had taught about community, about responsibility, about the difference between surviving and living. Now those lessons were playing out in front of her in lethal clarity. David's laugh was harsh in the winter air. "Poetry won't save you this time, Sarah. You think these townspeople, these farmers and shopkeepers, can match men who've killed their way across 3 territories?" But there was something beneath his bravado now, a growing realization that he had severely miscalculated. "They don't have to match them, David." Maria Vasquez's voice rang out clear and strong. "They just have to care more about protecting their homes than your men care about taking them." Her rifle remained rock-steady, covering Michael Carson with the same precision. She used hunting game for her family. James Carson, his face twisted with pain and rage, made a sudden move toward his dropped gun. But before he could reach it, bullets from 3 different directions kicked up snow around his feet, driving him back. The coordination of the shot spoke of long hours of practice, of a community that had learned to work together under Sarah's careful tutelage. "Tell me something, David." Sarah's voice carried genuine curiosity now. "All those months you spent watching, planning, preparing, did you ever wonder why I chose this valley? Why I built here instead of somewhere more remote?" She let the question hang in the frigid air for a moment. "Did you ever ask yourself what I saw in these people that made me willing to risk everything to protect them?" David's hand twitched closer to his hidden Walker Colt, but he knew better than to draw. Not yet. Not with so many rifles trained on him and his men. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Sarah? Always trying to make everyone see the deeper meaning." "No, David. I'm trying to give you one last chance. One last opportunity to walk away from this path that's brought nothing but death and pain." The wind carried her words across the yard. "The same chance I tried to give you in Yuma, before you chose revenge over redemption." The storm clouds above Pine Valley had begun to break, letting shafts of winter sunlight pierce the gloom. They illuminated a scene that had transformed from a simple homestead ambush into something far more complex. A community united against those who would threaten it, guided by a legend who had found purpose beyond the speed of her draw. "Last chance, old friend," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the weight of every choice, every battle, every lesson learned over decades of survival. "Surrender now. Face justice for what you've done, or make your play and face the consequences. But understand this. If you choose violence, you're not just fighting me anymore. You're fighting everyone here who's found something worth protecting." The winter wind howled across Pine Valley one final time, carrying with it the promise of violence about to erupt. David Carson, the man who thought he knew all of Swift Sarah Blackwood's secrets, was about to learn that some legends don't fade, they evolve, growing stronger by sharing their strength with others. The moment of decision crystallized in the frigid Montana air as David Carson's hand moved toward his concealed Walker Colt. 20 years of history, betrayal, and deadly skill hung in the balance as Swift Sarah Blackwood's legend prepared to meet its greatest test. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. "You know what your problem always was, Sarah." David's voice carried the weight of decades of bitterness. "You never could accept that sometimes violence is the only answer." His movement was a blur, the Walker Colt appearing in his hand with impossible speed. But Sarah hadn't survived this long by being predictable. Before David could level his weapon, her Remington barked twice in rapid succession. The first shot caught the Walker Colt perfectly, sending it spinning from his grip. The second shot took his hat off, a warning as precise as it was deadly. "No, David," Sarah's voice cut through the aftermath of the shots. "My problem was thinking I could save you from yourself." The Carson brothers exploded into action. James, despite his maimed hand, managed to scoop up his fallen gun. Michael produced a hidden derringer from his boot. Young Harrison, showing more courage than sense, made a desperate dive for the weapons Sarah had stripped from them earlier. The valley erupted in gunfire. Maria Vasquez's rifle caught Michael square in the shoulder, spinning him away from Sarah's position. Robert Chen's shot destroyed Harrison's borrowed gun before he could bring it to bear. Old Tom Wheeler demonstrated why 3 wars had taught him to respect accuracy over speed. His bullet catching James's gun hand and ending any threat from that quarter. But David Carson proved why he had once been Sarah's equal in the Phantom Ranges. Despite losing his primary weapon, he rolled with fluid grace behind the woodpile, producing another gun from a hidden holster. His first shot forced Sarah to abandon her carefully prepared position, while his second sent Chen diving for cover. "You've taught them well, Sarah," David called out, his voice carrying over the chaos, "but they're still amateurs playing at a professional's game." To prove his point, he sent a shot so close to Maria's position that she was forced to duck, temporarily leaving Michael Carson uncovered. Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson watched in fascination as the careful coordination Sarah had taught the townspeople began to show its true worth. When one shooter was forced to cover, another immediately filled the gap. When one position was compromised, 2 more opened up. It was like watching a complex dance where every step had been rehearsed to perfection. "See, that's where you're wrong again, David," Sarah replied, her voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "They're not playing at anything. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their future. What are your men fighting for?" As if to answer her question, young Harrison suddenly broke. The confidence that had marked his arrival was completely shattered. He threw down his weapon and ran for the horses, only to find them long gone, another piece of Sarah's careful planning. Michael Carson, his shoulder bleeding freely now, tried to rally his brother's men. "Stand and fight, you cowards!" But his words carried no weight. 2 more of David's hired guns dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender to Wheeler's unwavering rifle. James Carson, both hands now useless for shooting, slumped against a fence post. The feared Carson brothers, who had terrorized 3 territories, were being systematically dismantled by a widow and her makeshift army of townspeople. But David Carson wasn't finished. He had spent too many years planning this revenge to surrender now. "You remember Tucson, Sarah?" he shouted, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Remember how I taught you about having a final play, a last-ditch move that no one expects?" Sarah's response was immediate. "Mary, the signal." The girl instantly understood, triggering a mechanism that Sarah had installed months ago. Suddenly, the entire barn wall facing David's position dropped away, revealing a line of townspeople with rifles already aimed. "You're right, David," Sarah called out, her voice carrying genuine sadness now. "You did teach me about last plays. That's why I always make sure to have one more trick than anyone expects." The winter sun broke through the clouds completely, illuminating a scene that had transformed from a simple ambush into something far more complex. The Carson brothers' fearsome reputation lay in tatters, their men either surrendered or disabled. Only David remained a threat, but even his position behind the woodpile had been rendered useless by the barn's unexpected transformation. "It's over, David," Sarah announced, finally stepping into view. Her silver-streaked hair caught the sunlight, and the Remington in her hand looked as natural as breathing. "You can surrender and face justice, or you can play out this hand and join the legends that didn't live to see sunset. Your choice." David Carson's laugh carried all the bitterness of his years spent plotting revenge. "You think it's that simple? You think anything ever ends clean in our line of work?" His hand moved again, but this time towards something at his chest, a gesture Sarah recognized with horror. "Everybody down!" she shouted, but her warning was almost lost in the explosion that followed. David had saved one final surprise, a specially prepared charge of dynamite strapped to his chest. The blast sent wood and snow flying in all directions, creating a moment of perfect chaos. Through the smoke and confusion, Sarah's voice rang out with the same deadly precision as her shots. "Nobody move! Watch every direction! This isn't over!" She knew David too well to think he'd sacrifice himself without purpose. This was just another move in their deadly game, and she had to stay 3 steps ahead to keep her people alive. The explosion's aftermath left Pine Valley shrouded in a mix of smoke and snow, the peaceful homestead transformed into a battlefield. Sarah Matthews stood perfectly still, her Remington tracking any movement in the swirling chaos. She knew David Carson too well to believe he'd sacrificed himself without purpose. 20 years of experience told her this was just another tactical move, designed to create exactly this kind of confusion. "Everyone hold position," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had once made her legend. "This is exactly what he wants: chaos, confusion, divided attention." Through the settling debris, she could see her townspeople maintaining their positions, their training holding despite the shock of the explosion. Mary Wilson, watching from her observation post, caught a flicker of movement beneath the barn. The explosion had been perfectly calculated to mask the entrance to the old mine tunnels Sarah had mentioned earlier. The girl's hands moved to the signal mirror, but Sarah's voice stopped her. "No, Mary," she called out softly. "He'll be expecting that. Remember what I taught you about pattern breaks?" The girl nodded, understanding immediately. Instead of the usual signal, she began a different sequence of flashes, one they'd practiced but never used, meant specifically for situations where their standard protocols might be compromised. Through the smoke, James Carson struggled to his feet, both hands useless for shooting, but his voice still carrying threat. "You're dead, all of you, when David finishes whatever he's planning." His words cut off as Maria Vasquez's rifle pressed against his back. "Shut up," Maria ordered, her voice carrying the same steel that Sarah had helped forge over months of training. "Your brother's not the only one who knows how to plan." Around the yard, other townspeople were moving with precise coordination, securing the remaining Carson gang members while maintaining coverage of every possible angle. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, calculating David's likely moves. The explosion hadn't been meant to kill. It had been too controlled, too precise. It was meant to create an opportunity. But for what? Then she saw it, the pattern in the smoke, the way it moved differently near the old well. "Robert," she called out quietly to Chen, "remember that modification we made to the well housing last summer?" The blacksmith nodded, his rifle never wavering from his assigned sector. Time to put it to use. The next few moments unfolded with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Chen triggered a mechanism that caused the well's cover to suddenly split and drop away, revealing David Carson just as he was emerging from the hidden tunnel entrance beneath it. But David hadn't survived this long by being easily surprised. He rolled away from the exposure, coming up with another hidden gun, a pocket derringer that no one had detected. "Always 3 steps ahead, aren't you, Sarah?" David's voice carried genuine admiration beneath its deadly intent. "But so am I." He fired twice in rapid succession, not at Sarah, but at the rope holding the barn's heavy door. The massive timber began to fall toward where Maria was guarding James. Sarah's Remington roared 3 times in the space of a heartbeat. The first shot caught David's derringer, sending it spinning away. The second shot severed the barn door's remaining support rope, changing its trajectory away from Maria. The third shot caught David's shoulder, spinning him back against the well. "No, David," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "You're still playing the old game, looking for the clever twist, the hidden advantage. But I've learned there's something stronger than clever plans and secret weapons." As if to prove her point, the townspeople moved as one, each covering their assigned sectors, each protecting the other's blind spots. David Carson found himself facing not just swift Sarah Blackwood, but an entire community that had learned to fight as one. "Look around you," Sarah continued, moving with liquid grace to a position that kept David in clear view while staying protected herself. "These people aren't fighting because of clever plans or hidden tricks. They're fighting because they've found something worth protecting, something you never understood." David's laugh was harsh in the winter air. "And what's that, Sarah? The power of friendship? The strength of community?" His hand moved toward his boot, but before he could reach whatever weapon he had hidden there, 3 different rifles trained on him with unwavering precision. "No," Sarah answered, her voice carrying a sadness that made even David pause. The understanding that true strength isn't about being the fastest gun or the cleverest tactician. It's about being willing to stand beside others to protect something bigger than yourself. Mary watched from her position as the scene crystallized into its final moment. The smoke from the explosion had cleared, leaving the winter sun to illuminate a tableau that told the story of 2 different paths, one of isolation and revenge, the other of community and protection. "You want to know the real difference between us, David?" Sarah's voice carried across the yard, clear and strong. "You spent all these years planning how to tear things down. I spent them learning how to build something that would last." David Carson's face twisted with a complex mixture of emotions, rage, respect, and perhaps a touch of regret. His hand moved one final time, but Sarah was already in motion. The Remington in her hand seemed to materialize rather than be drawn. Its shot so precise, it caught David's last hidden weapon without drawing blood. "It's over," Sarah announced, but not to David. She was speaking to all of them, the townspeople who had stood with her, the Carson brothers who had underestimated her, and perhaps to the ghosts of her own past. Time to put the legend to rest and help build something new. The winter sun caught the silver in her hair as she stepped forward, the Remington steady in hands that had dealt both death and protection. Swift Sarah Blackwood's legend would live on, but not as a tale of lone vengeance. Instead, it would be remembered as a story of transformation, of how the West's deadliest gunslinger became something far more powerful, a protector who taught others to protect themselves. The silence that followed the final shot hung over Pine Valley like a heavy blanket, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and the winter wind's mournful whistle. David Carson sat slumped against the well housing, his arsenal of hidden weapons scattered uselessly around him. The other Carson brothers remained under guard, James nursing his maimed hand while Michael's shoulder wound slowly stained the snow crimson. "Martha!" Sarah called out to the town's healer, her voice carrying the same steady authority it had held throughout the confrontation. "See to their wounds. Whatever else they've done, we're not savages." The older woman moved forward with her medical bag, though Robert Chen and Maria Vasquez kept their rifles trained on the brothers while she worked. Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson finally allowed herself to relax her grip on the signal mirror, her hands shaking slightly from the released tension. She watched as Sarah moved through the aftermath with the same precise grace that had marked her actions during the fight, checking on each member of their makeshift militia, ensuring everyone was unharmed. "You've changed, Sarah," David spoke up, his voice carrying a mix of resignation and curiosity as Martha tended to his shoulder. "The Sarah Blackwood I knew would have ended this differently." His eyes tracked her movement across the yard, studying her as if trying to solve a puzzle. Sarah paused in her rounds, turning to face her former partner. "The Sarah Blackwood you knew died in Dodge City, David, just like the David Carson I knew died in that prison riot." She moved closer, the Remington still ready, but not threatening. "We all choose our paths. You chose revenge. I chose something else." The winter sun had begun its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the transformed homestead. Bullet holes marked walls and fences, the explosion had left its scars on the barn, and the pristine snow was trampled and bloodied. Yet somehow the scene carried an air not of destruction, but of resolve. "Round them up," Sarah instructed her people, nodding toward David's remaining men. "Tom, send word to the marshal in Helena. Tell him we've got the Carson gang and enough witnesses to ensure they see justice this time." The old veteran nodded, already heading for his horse. Young Harrison, still pale and shaken, spoke up from where he sat under guard. "What? What'll happen to us?" His youthful bravado had been completely stripped away, leaving only the scared boy beneath. Sarah studied him for a moment before responding. "That depends on the marshal and the territorial judge," she answered honestly. "But I'll speak for you, boy. You've got a chance to choose a different path, if you're wise enough to take it." Her eyes moved to David. "Some of us learn that lesson too late." Mary emerged from the cabin, carrying coffee for the townspeople who had stood their ground. As she moved among them, Sarah saw how the girl had grown during this confrontation. She carried herself with new confidence, understanding now why all those lessons in observation and strategy had been so important. "You know this isn't really over," David called out, even as Martha finished bandaging his shoulder. "There'll be others, men who've heard the legend, who'll want to test themselves against swift Sarah Blackwood." His words carried the weight of experience, of knowing how reputation worked in their violent world. Sarah's response surprised him. "You're right," she acknowledged, turning to address not just David, but all her people. "There will be others. That's why every lesson, every practice session, every preparation wasn't just about today. It was about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after." The townspeople gathered closer, understanding the significance of her words. Robert Chen rested his rifle against his shoulder, speaking up with quiet certainty. "Then we'll be ready, just like we were today." Around him, others nodded in agreement. "That's what you never understood, David," Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the yard. "True strength isn't about being the fastest gun or the cleverest tactician. It's about building something that lasts, something that grows stronger with each challenge." As if to emphasize her point, more riders appeared at the valley's entrance. Neighbors from outlying farms who had heard the gunfire and come to help. They arrived to find not a scene of destruction, but one of community triumph, of people standing together against those who would threaten their peace. "Take a good look," Sarah told the Carson brothers as more townspeople arrived. "This is what you were really fighting against. Not just one retired gunslinger, but an entire community that learned to protect itself." Her voice carried no mockery, only a quiet certainty. "That's a force more powerful than any gun." The winter day was drawing to a close, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and purple. Sarah Matthews stood among her people, the Remington still ready at her side, but no longer the only source of protection. She had transformed not just herself, but an entire community, turning a legend of lone vengeance into a story of shared strength. Martha finished treating the last of the wounds and packed up her medical bag. "They'll live," she announced with professional detachment, "though some might wish they wouldn't when the marshal gets done with them." Her words carried the weight of frontier justice, tempered by mercy, but unyielding in its purpose. As the sun set over Pine Valley, Sarah watched her people secure the prisoners and tend to the damage. Swift Sarah Blackwood's legend had been reborn today, but not as a tale of deadly skill or clever tactics. Instead, it would be remembered as a story of transformation, of how one woman's choice to protect rather than destroy had changed not just her own fate, but the fate of an entire community. As twilight settled over Pine Valley, the full weight of the day's events began to sink in. The Carson brothers had been secured in the reinforced root cellar, their wounds treated, while their remaining men were held under guard in the barn. Sarah Matthews stood on her front porch, watching as her community transformed back from a militia into neighbors, though something fundamental had changed in how they carried themselves. "Time for the whole truth, isn't it?" David Carson's voice carried from where he sat under guard. "About Thomas, about what really happened that day. They deserve to know, Sarah, especially if they're going to be carrying your legacy." His words hung in the cold evening air, heavy with unspoken history. Sarah's hand tightened imperceptibly on her Remington, but her voice remained steady. "You're right. They do deserve the truth." She turned to face her people, who had gathered close to hear. Mary Wilson stood at the front, her young face showing both anticipation and concern. "2 years ago," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness, "Thomas didn't die by random chance. He died because of a choice I made, a choice that David here forced upon me." She paused, the silver in her hair catching the last light of day. "The day the Phantom Rangers fell apart." Inside the cabin, Mary remembered finding an old wanted poster hidden in Sarah's dresser, showing a younger version of the widow with a reward that would have bought half the territory. Now she understood why Sarah had kept it, not as a reminder of glory, but as a warning of the price of past decisions. "You see," Sarah continued, "David didn't just betray the Rangers. He gave our enemies a choice: hunt us down one by one, or let him do it for them. He knew all our hiding places, all our methods, all our secrets." Her eyes met David's across the yard. "All except one." Robert Chen spoke up, his rifle still trained on the prisoners. "What secret was that, Mrs. Matthews?" The respect in his voice made it clear that knowing her true identity hadn't changed how he saw her. "The secret of why the Rangers really existed," Sarah replied. "We weren't just peacekeepers or gunfighters. We were protecting something. Information about corruption in the territorial government, evidence that could have brought down some very powerful people." David's laugh was bitter in the gathering darkness. "Evidence that died with Thomas, didn't it, Sarah? That was the choice I gave you. Your husband's life or those documents. And you chose the documents." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath as Sarah faced this moment of truth. "No, David. I chose justice over revenge. Thomas," her voice caught slightly, "Thomas made that choice with me. He knew what those documents meant, how many lives they could save, how much corruption they could expose. Martha, the healer, stepped forward. "That's why you trained us, isn't it? Not just to protect ourselves, but to protect whatever you managed to save that day." Her words carried understanding rather than accusation. Sarah nodded slowly. Thomas and I had split up the evidence, hidden it in different places. When David's men caught up to him, he'd already passed his portion to trusted contacts. He died protecting not just information, but the chance for real change in the territories. "Dulm, the documents you were supposed to be protecting," David spat, "would have made us rich beyond imagination. The bribes those officials offered for their destruction could have set us up for life." "And that's the difference between us, David," Sarah replied, her voice carrying both sadness and steel. "You saw an opportunity for profit. Thomas and I saw a responsibility to something larger than ourselves." She turned to face her people fully. "Just like what we built here is larger than any one of us." Mary suddenly understood all those lessons in the root cellar, learning to hide things in plain sight, to create hiding places that looked natural. She wasn't just being taught to survive, she was being trained to protect, to carry on a legacy that went beyond mere gunfighting. "The evidence is still out there," David said, "but it wasn't a question. Hidden with people like these, ordinary folks who've learned to be extraordinary." His voice carried a mix of grudging admiration and bitter realization. Sarah moved among her people, touching shoulders, meeting eyes, acknowledging the bond that had been forged in fire. That's what Thomas understood, what he died protecting. Real change doesn't come from lone heroes or clever schemes. It comes from communities standing together, from ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things. The last light faded from the valley as Sarah's words sank in. Her people understood now that they weren't just defending a homestead or protecting a widow. They were part of something larger, a network of justice that operated not through violence, but through the quiet strength of people standing together. "So now you know," Sarah concluded, her voice carrying in the darkness, "why I chose this valley, why I spent so much time preparing you all, why today's fight was about more than just survival." She turned to face David one last time, and why the legend of swift Sarah Blackwood had to die, so something stronger could take its place. The night settled over Pine Valley, bringing with it not just darkness, but understanding. The quiet widow who had trained them so patiently hadn't just been preparing them for one confrontation, but for a continuing mission. They had become not just defenders of their homes, but guardians of a truth that could reshape their world. The dawning of the next day brought more than just sunlight to Pine Valley. As the community gathered to assess the aftermath of yesterday's confrontation, there was a palpable change in how they carried themselves. The quiet farming town had been transformed not just by the victory over the Carson gang, but by the deeper understanding of who they had become. "The marshal's riding in from Helena," Tom Wheeler announced, returning from his messenger run. "Says he's bringing a proper prison wagon for the Carson brothers and their men." The old veteran's voice carried a note of satisfaction, but Sarah noticed he kept his rifle close at hand, a habit she'd helped instill that wouldn't fade easily. Mary Wilson worked alongside the other townspeople, helping to repair the damage from yesterday's fight, but she moved differently now, her young eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, applying the lessons Sarah had taught her in ways that went beyond mere survival. She'd begun to understand that awareness wasn't just about staying alive. It was about protecting others. "You've built something remarkable here," David Carson observed from his place under guard. His voice carried a complexity of emotions, respect, regret, and perhaps a touch of envy. Not just a defensive position, but a community of protectors. Thomas would have appreciated the irony. Sarah paused in her work of patching bullet holes in the barn wall. Thomas understood what you never did, David. The strongest walls aren't built of wood or stone, but of trust and shared purpose. She turned to face her former partner. That's what the Rangers could have been, if you'd seen beyond the power and profit. Around the homestead, evidence of the previous day's battle was being erased, but deeper marks remained. Robert Chen's smithy now doubled as an armory, his skill with metal extending beyond horseshoes to maintaining the weapons that protected their community. Maria Vasquez's keen eye for hunting had transformed into something more strategic, teaching others how to watch the valley's approaches. "Mrs. Matthews," Mary called out, using the name that was no longer just a cover but a symbol of transformation. "I've been thinking about those ledgers you taught me to keep." The girl's voice carried new confidence. "They're not just about recording supplies, are they? They're codes, ways to pass information without drawing attention." Sarah smiled, seeing how her careful lessons had taken root. Smart girl. Just like those reading lessons weren't just about letters and words. Everything serves multiple purposes when you're building something meant to last. She gathered her people closer, knowing it was time for the next phase of their evolution. "Yesterday wasn't just about defending our homes," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "It was about choosing what kind of community we want to be." The Carson gang thought they were facing one retired gunslinger. Instead, they found something far more powerful, people who had learned to stand together. James Carson, his bandaged hands making him look more vulnerable than fearsome, spoke up from where he sat with his brothers. "All this talk of community and protection, you're still a killer, Blackwood. We all are. That's something that doesn't wash off." "You're right," Sarah acknowledged, surprising everyone with her candor. "The skills I learned, the lives I took, those can't be undone, but they can be transformed." She gestured to the valley around them. "Every skill I taught these people came from those violent years, but now those same skills protect rather than destroy." Martha, treating Michael Carson's shoulder wound, nodded in understanding. "Like how you taught me to know where a bullet might be lodged by understanding how you used to place your shots. Or how Mr. Chen learned to reinforce doors by knowing how others might try to break them down." The winter sun climbed higher, illuminating the valley that had become more than just a hiding place. Sarah moved among her people, each interaction carrying new meaning. She showed Maria how to adjust her rifle sights using techniques learned in a dozen gunfights. She demonstrated to Robert how to spot a hidden weapon by remembering how she used to conceal her own. "The world's changing," Sarah announced, addressing not just her community but the Carson brothers as well. "The old ways of the gun, lone wolves prowling the frontier, that's fading, but the need for protection, for justice, for standing together against those who would prey on the weak, that never changes." Young Harrison, still under guard but listening intently, spoke up. Could you teach others, people who want to change?" His voice carried both hope and uncertainty. "Not the killing parts, but the protecting parts." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. That's exactly what Thomas would have wanted, transformation rather than elimination. "When you've served your time, assuming you're serious about changing, come back to Pine Valley. We'll see if you're ready to learn the harder path." The day continued, full of activity and purpose. The marshal would arrive soon, justice would take its course, but something more important was taking shape in Pine Valley. Swift Sarah Blackwood's legend had not just survived. It had evolved into something stronger, something that could be passed down through generations. "Each of you," Sarah addressed her people as they worked, "carries a piece of the skills I learned in violence. But you've transformed them into something better. You're not just defenders, you're teachers, protectors, builders of something that will outlast any gunfighter's reputation." David Carson watched this transformation with complex emotions playing across his face. The partner he had betrayed had not just survived, she had transcended their violent past to create something he had never imagined possible. The legend he had tried to destroy had instead become immortal in the most unexpected way. The marshal's arrival in Pine Valley brought with it the weight of official justice, but the community that greeted him bore little resemblance to the quiet farming town he'd known before. The changes weren't just in the armed men and women who carefully watched his approach, or in the professional way they secured his prison wagon. The transformation was deeper, written in how they carried themselves, how they moved together, how they understood their place in a larger purpose. "Quite a story you've got here, Sarah," Marshal Jenkins said quietly, after the Carson brothers and their men were secured. He'd known her in her ranger days, had helped spread the tale of her supposed death in Dodge City. "Word of this is going to spread, you know. Other communities will want to know how one town stood up to the Carson gang." Sarah stood on her porch, watching as her people continued their work of rebuilding and strengthening the valley's defenses. "Let it spread," she replied, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "What we've built here isn't meant to be a secret anymore. It's meant to be an example." Inside the cabin, Mary Wilson was teaching younger children the same observation games Sarah had once taught her. But now these lessons carried new weight, new purpose. The children weren't just learning to spot details, they were learning to be part of something larger than themselves. "The territorial governor won't like this," Jenkins warned, though his tone carried more admiration than concern. "Armed towns, trained civilians, organized resistance to outlaws. It's not the kind of thing that makes politicians comfortable." He paused, studying Sarah's face, especially not with those documents still out there. Sarah's smile carried decades of hard-won wisdom. "That's exactly why it needs to happen. The frontier's changing, John. The days of lone gunfighters and roving outlaws are ending, but the need for justice, for communities to protect themselves, that's only growing stronger." Robert Chen approached, carrying something wrapped in oiled cloth. "The modifications to the barn door are complete, Mrs. Matthews, and we've started implementing those new security measures you suggested." He unwrapped the package, revealing a newly forged set of tools that could serve both peaceful and defensive purposes. "Good," Sarah nodded, seeing how naturally her people had adapted to their dual roles. "Remember what I taught you about layers of defense. Every improvement should look ordinary to outsiders, but serve multiple purposes for those who know." Maria Vasquez joined them, her rifle slung comfortably across her back as she delivered her report. "The outlying farms are organizing their own training groups. After word spread about the Carson gang, every homestead wants to learn what you taught us." Her voice carried pride mixed with responsibility. "And they will," Sarah assured her, "but not just the shooting and the fighting. They need to learn the harder lessons, about community, about standing together, about choosing protection over violence." She turned back to Marshal Jenkins. "That's what makes this different from just another armed camp." The marshal watched as the townspeople went about their business, noting how seamlessly they integrated their new defensive roles with their daily lives. Farmers carried rifles as naturally as they did pitchforks. Children played games that doubled as surveillance practice. Even the town's layout had subtly shifted to provide better security while maintaining its peaceful appearance. "You've started something here, Sarah," Jenkins observed. "Something bigger than just one town defending itself. You've created a model that others will want to follow." He gestured to where David Carson sat in the prison wagon, watching the scene with complex emotions. "Even your enemies can see it." Sarah moved among her people, each interaction demonstrating the deeper changes that had taken root. Martha wasn't just a healer anymore. She was teaching others how to treat wounds under fire. Tom Wheeler's war stories had transformed into practical lessons about coordination and teamwork. Every skill, every lesson, every improvement served the dual purpose of building both community and security. The real change, Sarah explained, watching Mary lead another group of children through their observation exercises, isn't in the weapons or the tactics. It's in helping people understand that true strength comes from standing together, that protecting others is more powerful than any gun. As the day progressed, more riders arrived from neighboring communities, drawn by word of what had happened with the Carson gang. They found not a battlefield, but a thriving town, one that had learned to balance peace with preparedness, strength with wisdom. Each person who comes here seeking just the gun skills, Sarah told Jenkins as they watched the newcomers arrive, will learn what Thomas taught me, that the hardest battles are won not with bullets, but with choices. Choices about who we become, about what we stand for. The marshal nodded thoughtfully, understanding the fuller implications of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just one town's response to a threat. It was the beginning of a new way of thinking about frontier justice and community protection. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood will still spread, he noted, but not as a tale of lone vengeance anymore. This is something different, something that could change the whole territory. His eyes tracked the smooth coordination of the townspeople going about their work, something that already is changing it. Sarah touched the Remington at her side, the weapon that had once defined her, but now served a different purpose. That's exactly what Thomas would have wanted, not just the end of one legend, but the beginning of something stronger, something that can't be killed by bullets or broken by betrayal. The sun climbed high over Pine Valley, illuminating a community that had been transformed not just by conflict, but by choice. The quiet widow who had seemed an easy target had helped forge something unprecedented, a town where every member was both protector and protected, where strength meant more than just the speed of a draw or the accuracy of a shot. A month after the Carson brothers' defeat, Pine Valley had become something unprecedented in the Montana Territory. The quiet farming community had transformed into a beacon of hope for other towns plagued by lawlessness. Sarah Matthews, still known to most as the widow who ran the valley's most prosperous homestead, found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to create. 3 more families arrived yesterday, Mary Wilson reported during their morning meeting. The girl, now a young woman in bearing if not quite in years, had taken on the role of coordinating the valley's growing network of defenders. They heard about what happened with the Carson gang. They're looking for more than just safety. They want to learn. Sarah stood at her cabin window, watching the morning activities in the valley below. Robert Chen's smithy now doubled as a training ground where he taught others how to forge both tools and defenses. Maria Vasquez led daily patrols that looked like simple hunting parties to outsiders but maintained a vigilant watch over the community. "And what did you tell these families?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She had trained Mary well, not just in observation and tactics, but in understanding the deeper purpose behind their work. "I told them what you taught me," Mary replied, her voice carrying the confidence of hard-won wisdom. "That true security isn't about guns or fences. It's about building something worth protecting and then teaching others to protect it too." The morning sun caught the silver in Sarah's hair as she moved to the porch where several of the town's leaders had gathered for their daily council. Martha, Tom Wheeler, and the others had adapted their regular roles to include new responsibilities, creating a system of community defense that looked utterly natural to outside eyes. "Word came from Helena," Tom reported, his weathered face serious. "The Carson brothers' trial is set for next month, but that's not the important news." He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. "Those documents you and Thomas protected? They're starting to make waves." 3 territorial judges have been removed for corruption. 2 more resigned before they could be investigated. Sarah nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Thomas's sacrifice and its continuing impact. He always said the truth was more powerful than any bullet. Turns out he was right about that, like he was right about so many things. A rider approached from the valley's entrance, and Sarah noted with pride how smoothly the community's defensive measures activated. Signals passed between watchpoints, positions were adjusted, all without any obvious movement that would alarm an innocent traveler. The rider turned out to be Marshal Jenkins, returning from his escort of the Carson gang to Helena. His expression carried news before he even dismounted. "Thought you should hear this from me, Sarah. David Carson asked to make a deal." The gathered townspeople tensed, but Sarah remained calm. "What kind of deal?" she asked, though her hand unconsciously moved closer to her Remington. "He wants to talk," Jenkins replied, accepting the coffee Martha offered. "Says he's ready to confirm everything. The corruption, the bribes, the whole network that he was protecting. Says watching what you built here made him realize some things." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. David Carson's testimony could break open the last remnants of the corruption that Sarah and Thomas had fought against. But Sarah's expression remained thoughtful. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked, reading the marshal's face like she'd taught her people to read approaching riders. Jenkins nodded. "He also asked about that young man Harrison. Wanted to know if your offer was serious, about teaching him a different path once he's served his time." The marshal's eyes met Sarah's. "Seems your example is affecting more than just honest folks." Sarah moved to the edge of her porch, looking out over the valley that had become so much more than just a hiding place. Children played games that doubled as training exercises. Women worked at tasks that maintained both home and security. Men carried tools that could serve as weapons if needed. But none of it looked military or threatening, just a community that had learned to protect its own. "You know what Thomas used to say about redemption?" she asked, her voice carrying to all those gathered. "He said it wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing a different future, about taking the skills and experiences that shaped us and turning them towards something better." Mary stepped forward, her young face serious. "That's what you've been teaching us all along, isn't it? Not just how to fight, but how to choose when not to fight, how to build something strong enough that it doesn't need to prove its strength." The morning breeze carried the scent of spring, of new growth and possibility. Sarah touched the phoenix mark on her Remington's grip, feeling the weight of all it represented. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood used to be about how many men she could kill, she said quietly. Now it's about how many people she can teach to protect life instead. Marshal Jenkins surveyed the valley, noting the subtle signs of preparation and readiness that underlay its peaceful appearance. "You've started something here, Sarah. Something that could change the whole territory. These people aren't just defending their homes. They're building a new way of thinking about justice and community." Sarah watched as her students, for they were all her students now, whether they carried guns or plows, went about their daily tasks. Each one moved with the awareness she had taught them. Each one understood their role in the larger purpose they served. "That's what Thomas died protecting," she replied, her voice firm with conviction. "Not just documents or evidence, but the chance for real change. The opportunity to build something that could grow and spread, teaching others that true strength comes from standing together." The sun rose higher over Pine Valley, illuminating a community that had become more than just a refuge for a retired gunslinger. It had become a symbol of transformation, a living example of how the skills of violence could be turned toward protection, how the lessons of the past could build a better future. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood would live on, but not as a tale of lone vengeance or deadly skill. Instead, It would be remembered as a story of transformation, of how the West's deadliest gunslinger became something far more powerful, a teacher who showed others how to turn strength into protection, fear into resolve, and isolation into community. 5 years after the Carson brothers' defeat, Pine Valley had blossomed into something that even Sarah Matthews could never have predicted. The quiet widow's homestead had become a school of sorts, though not one that any outsider would recognize at first glance. People came from across the territory, seeking not just protection, but understanding, not just skills, but wisdom. Another letter from young Harrison, Mary Wilson announced, bringing the morning mail to Sarah's porch. Now a full-grown woman of 22, Mary had become more than just a student. She was a teacher in her own right, carrying forward the lessons that had transformed their community. Sarah sat in her rocking chair, her silver hair catching the morning light. The Remington still rode at her hip, but these days it served more as a reminder than a threat. "What does our reformed gunslinger have to say?" she asked, though the slight smile suggested she already knew. "He's established another training center in Wyoming," Mary reported, reading from the letter. "Says he's using everything you taught him about building community defense without creating an armed camp. Even has some former outlaws helping him teach others to change their ways." The valley below hummed with activity. Robert Chen's smithy had expanded into a full trading post, where visitors could find both practical tools and subtle defensive improvements. Maria Vasquez now led a network of ranger patrols that protected not just Pine Valley, but the surrounding communities as well. "You know what's remarkable?" Sarah mused, watching a group of children playing one of the awareness games she had designed. "Thomas always said that true change happens slowly, like water wearing away stone. But look at what 5 years has brought us." Indeed, the changes were profound. The territorial governor, who had once feared armed communities, now pointed to Pine Valley as a model of civilian protection. The corrupt officials exposed by Thomas's sacrificed evidence had been replaced by those who understood the importance of community justice. Marshal Jenkins rode into the valley, no longer needing to signal his approach. The watching posts had recognized him miles out. He carried news that would once have seemed impossible. "The territorial legislature just passed the Community Defense Act," he announced, without preamble. "Based entirely on what you've built here, Sarah, every town will have the right to organize its own protection, following the Pine Valley model." Sarah's hand touched the phoenix mark on her Remington's grip, remembering all the paths that had led to this moment. "David Carson still writing his memoirs from prison?" she asked, though she knew the answer. 3 volumes published so far," Jenkins confirmed. "His account of the corruption he once protected has done more to clean up the territory than a dozen posses could have. And his description of what you've built here," he gestured to the valley, "well, that's becoming required reading for every marshal and sheriff in the territory." Mary sorted through the rest of the mail, letters from other communities seeking guidance, reports from their growing network of trained protectors, even a note from the governor himself requesting Sarah's input on new territorial defense policies. "Never thought I'd see the day," old Tom Wheeler commented from his usual spot on the porch steps, "when outlaws study how not to be outlaws, and lawmen learn that the best fights are the ones you prevent." The old veteran had become one of their most effective teachers, showing others how to turn military experience toward community protection. A rider approached from the North Trail, and Sarah watched with pride as her security system activated. Signals passed subtly between watchers, positions were adjusted, all without any obvious movement that would alarm a peaceful traveler. The system she had designed had become so natural that even children participated without thinking about it. "Widow Matthews," the rider called out as he reached the yard, "I've come from a town up in Dakota Territory. We've been having trouble with raiders, and we heard—" He paused, taking in the peaceful scene before him. We heard you could teach us how to protect ourselves." Sarah rose from her rocker, her movement still carrying the fluid grace that had once made her legendary. "Welcome to Pine Valley," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the promise of change. "Tell me about your community." As she listened to the man's story, Sarah reflected on how far they had come. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood had evolved into something she never could have imagined in her gunfighting days. Instead of tales of deadly skill and lone vengeance, her name was now synonymous with transformation and protection. "You know what Thomas would say about all this?" she asked Mary later, as they watched the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. "He'd say that the most powerful legacy isn't in who you kill or how fast you can draw. It's in what you help others become." The evening brought more visitors. Farmers, merchants, even a few reformed outlaws, all seeking the knowledge that Pine Valley had become famous for. Sarah watched as her community welcomed them, each person playing their part in the careful dance of hospitality and vigilance she had designed. "Swift Sarah Blackwood died in Dodge City," she told a gathering of new students that evening, "but what rose from those ashes was something far more powerful than any gunslinger's legend. Here, we don't teach you how to be the fastest gun or the deadliest shot. We teach you how to make sure those skills are never needed." As night fell over Pine Valley, Sarah Matthews stood on her porch, the Remington at her hip more symbol now than weapon. The legend of the deadly gunslinger had transformed into something that would outlast any tale of violence, a legacy of protection, of community, of turning the skills of war toward the preservation of peace. The story of the quiet widow who faced down the Carson gang had become more than just another frontier tale. It had become a blueprint for change, a demonstration that even the deadliest skills could be turned toward life rather than death, that the strongest communities were built not on fear, but on shared purpose. "Remember," she told her students, her voice carrying the wisdom of all her years, "the most important battles are won not with bullets, but with choices. Choose to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than break, to stand together rather than alone." That's the true legacy of Pine Valley. And in the years that followed, that legacy would continue to grow, spreading across the frontier like seeds carried on the wind, transforming communities one choice at a time. The legend of swift Sarah Blackwood had indeed become immortal, not as a tale of death, but as a story of rebirth, of how the skills of violence could be transformed into the tools of protection, of how one woman's choice to change could help an entire territory find a better way. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.